Hello and welcome back to Psychology 300. This is Research Methods in Psychology. I'm Dr. Williams, and today we're going to be talking about issues related to Chapter 11, but specifically related to the history of single subject methods. This is not covered very thoroughly in your textbook, and I wanted to give you a little bit of background on single subject the history of the use of single subject methodology, because you're not likely to get this information anywhere else. So the first thing I would like to start with is to say briefly that statistics are not new. Probability theory was not formally established until the 17th and 18th century. By the late 1700s, there actually was a word, statistics, to define a sort of a systematic collection of demographic and economic data. It was being primarily used in the late 1800s by the U.S. government to deal with economic issues related to the different states and their needs. And so the use of statistics started around the 1800s, but for very different reasons than the reasons we use them today. By 1800, the field of astronomy had begun to use simple probability models and statistical theories. You know, in astronomy, you can't actually go out and measure things, and you have to make guesses about where things are going to be at certain times. And so they started using, Blaise Pascal had started his work in probability theory back in the mid-1600s. And so these mathematical methods of statistics sort of emerged out of that preliminary probability theory. By the mid-17th century, Thomas Bayes of Bayes' theorem had begun to develop ways of interpreting probabilities that made it possible for them to use probability theory in a much broader way across the sciences. So it wasn't until 1916 when Sir Ronald Fisher took a job as a statistician at Rothamsted Experimental Station for Agricultural Research in Great Britain, where he studied wheat and other field crops and other kinds of agricultural data. And he was hired as a statistician. So his job was to use statistics to help them draw conclusions about the different kinds of agricultural research that they were doing. And it was through this study of they were using different kinds of fertilizers and different kinds of growing techniques, and he was hired to figure out a way to compare different, I guess you would call them plots of land growing crops, where they systematically varied what they planted and what the soil was like, what the soil composition was like, and what kind of fertilizer they used. And it was here that he developed what we know today as the analysis of variance. It was basically developed to compare different crop treatments and different growth patterns. So, Sir Ronald Fisher, his interests, as we move forward into closer to the 1920s, his interests expanded beyond agriculture and toward more of human genetics, and he proposed a formal analysis of variance in an article that he published in 1918 called The Correlation Between Relatives on the Supposition of Mendelian Inheritance. So he was taking Mendelian genetics, you know, Gregor Mendel and his little smooth and wrinkly peas, and how he developed a genetic model for inheritance for peas in the agricultural world, which Sir Ronald Fisher was affiliated with, and applied it. Ronald Fisher was the one who took that idea and applied it to humans. His first formal application of the ANOVA was published in 1921, and in 1925 the ANOVA had become widely known after Fisher published a textbook entitled Statistical Methods. So here's a little aside about Sir Ronald Fisher, just FYI. By 1933, Sir Ronald Fisher had become a professor at the University of the College of London in the eugenics department. And he believed that both statistical evidence and everyday experience showed two things. One, that human groups differed profoundly, quote, in their innate capacity for intellectual and emotional development, unquote. And the, quote, practical international problem is that of learning to share the resources of this planet with persons of materially different nature. So, unquote. So Fisher was a believer that humans were genetically different in terms of their intellectual and emotional development, implying that some individuals or some races, if you will, were superior to others, and that we needed to use our understanding of genetics, economics, and statistics to make cases for how and in what ways the wealth of the world would be distributed. So kind of an interesting, he was kind of a man of his day, and eugenics didn't have the same negative connotation that it does today. I mean, we have a lot of learning and social experience under our belt that they were not privy to. And so, but you should know that that was his main purpose, was to use statistics to show these genetic differences between races. So and remember that the analysis of variance came out in 1925. So that means that the analysis of variance is this year is only, the textbook came out in 1925, and that would make it 90 years old. So the ANOVA is less than 100 years old. Science has been around for a lot longer. Science has long relied on raw data and repeated observation to determine the effects of different treatments. P less than 0.05 has not always been the holy grail of the scientific method. It isn't until the 1930s that a statistically based group design for psychology became a research standard. So I think it's important to remember when we look at single subject designs to realize that we are using methods that are much older and much more sophisticated in terms of their methodology than and much older than the use of statistical and probability theory in experimental psychology. Small N designs were common up through the 1930s. There were no control groups per se. You had primarily A-B designs and then replication. So they would measure, manipulate, and measure again, and then go back and replicate the phenomenon. And this was true not only for behavior, but especially for biology and chemistry and physics. There were no statistical analyses, not the ones we use today, in order to determine whether something had changed or not. Fisher's book on statistical methods changed that. It is a turning point for the sciences. ANOVAs and correlational methods became popular. The interrelationship between variables became much more probability-based than observationally based. And because it was considered cutting edge, if you wanted to be considered scientific and on the leading edge of your science, you would need to employ the use of statistics, especially if you were looking for financial support from the university or from the federal government. The famous psychological historian E.G. Boring lent his support to the use of statistics, considering it to be a dramatic improvement in the ability to do research in psychology. Whether they were right or wrong still stands to be determined. We just don't know. But I think you need to remember that when you're using single case methods, when you're using single subject designs, you're really standing among some of the biggest giants in psychology. People like Wilhelm Wundt, a father of psychology, Ebbinghaus and his memory research, Ivan Pavlov and respondent conditioning, Bechterev and psychoreflexology, Fechner's psychophysics, E.L. Thorndike's puzzle boxes and the law of effect, Wolfgang Kohler and his Gestalt psychology and his insight work with the chimpanzee sultan. And Robert Yerkes, the famous ethologist and primatologist who did IQ testing. Many of these individuals and many more used single subject designs to do their research. So this is a very well-established methodology, and just because it's old and not based on probability theory does not mean that it's not relevant or not valid. Okay, we have one more lecture with a little bit more history on single subject design, and then we'll be done with chapter 11. All right, have a nice afternoon. Bye.